Hi everybody, my name is Paul Vacheski and welcome to today's video. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on wholesaling in Nebraska. In my first video, we discussed basically what a wholesaling transaction is, what it looks like. If you have not seen that, or you're not really familiar with a wholesaling transaction, I highly recommend you go back and watch part 1 first. I'll leave a link right here. In today's video, we're going to discuss the rules, regulations, the regulatory requirements that wholesalers must comply with, and what broker licensees need to comply with as well, because the new rules and regulations were drafted and approved by the Nebraska Real Estate Commission, who is the enforcement agency tasked in Nebraska with enforcing these rules and regs. Again, this is applicable to both wholesalers, licensed or not, and to those brokers, agents that are representing the wholesaler in marketing their equitable title in a contract. And that is the subject of today's video. As I said in my opening monologue here, the final rules and regulations have been drafted. They have been approved by the Real Estate Commission, and there are some things that you as wholesalers and agents representing your wholesalers, you have to know. Now, real quickly, there is, I talked to Director Lemon, or I had correspondence with Director Lemon regarding the new rules and regulations. And one of the things that's interesting is they mentioned in the written opinion of all the new rules and regs is failure to comply with everything that we're going to talk about here in today's video, whether you're a wholesaler or an agent representing that wholesaler, is deemed to be a license law violation subject to regulatory enforcement. So I wanted to really outline everything that you need to know primarily as an agent representing the wholesaler, but you wholesalers also need to know this because you're going to have to provide a lot of extra documentation that you don't want to provide to your agent because it's required by license law. The first of those requirements is agency disclosures, and I'm not going to go into the details of agency relationships and those type of things because it's already presumed that you as a licensee knows what those are. But there was a lot of confusion prior to this regulation, like who represents who, where did the disclosures go, etc. So here is what you need to know. Number one, listing agents, brokers that are going to represent the wholesaler. There are a couple of agency disclosures individually done that's going to be needed. And I'm going to walk you through this entire process basically from cradle to grave. Number one, you show up at a listing, you're going to list that equitable interest for the wholesaler. Now, as I said in the previous video, the part 1 of this series, a wholesaler can go out and engage with a property owner and enter into a purchase contract without the assistance of a licensee. That is still very legal. Once that contract is put into place, obviously, that wholesaler wants to find an end buyer. It's the marketing part that is required. So marketing is broadly defined, even, and I get this a lot from wholesalers, well, I already have a pre-existing list of potential buyers. It doesn't matter. If you communicate in any way whatsoever using any medium, you are deemed to be marketing your equitable title. So this pre-existing list do not matter anymore. You have to list it with a licensed Nebraska real estate broker and comply with the new rules and regs. And part of the rules and regs says that that agent's going to enter into a listing contract with the wholesaler, not the property owner, the wholesaler, because the wholesaler is the one is trying to sell their equitable interest. Now, that requires agency disclosures to be created and executed. Now, here's the first agency disclosure required. Listing agents, when that wholesaler signs the listing contract, then an agency disclosure is required. Agents, you're going to be the limited seller's agent, and the wholesaler is the client principal. In the third video of this series, I'm actually going to put these agency disclosures on the screen, and we're going to go through them so you have a better understanding, because there is an addendum to that agency disclosure that you're going to also be required to make sure is done. But the first agency disclosure required for your listing packet is between the listing agent and that wholesaler. Number 2 is the agency disclosure for the property owner. Now remember, you're the listing agent. You may not have ever met the property owner because obviously the purchase agreement was agreed to between the wholesaler and the property owner prior to that wholesaler reaching out to you to list their equitable title. But license law requires the listing agent, the listing broker, to give the property owner an agency disclosure, and the relationship between the listing agent broker and the property owner must be customer only. Now, a couple of things I want to say here. Number 1 is listing agents, do not allow the wholesaler to present this agency disclosure on your behalf, even if they have some kind of general power of attorney. You need to meet with or initiate the conversation with that property owner to explain what a customer agency is, why this is required, and present that disclosure to them. Now, the next question is, what happens if the property owner tells you to pack sand, they don't want to sign it, etc.? Well, then we do what we would normally do. None of our clients or customers are obligated to sign the disclosure. We are obligated to present it and disclose our agency relationship. If that person, the property owner, says, I'm not going to sign it, then you simply make a notation on the form of the date and time it was presented and just indicate that they refuse to sign. That's all you have to do. So right now we have two agency disclosures that you as a listing agent are required to procure. One for the wholesaler, which you are representing. They are your client and you are their limited agent. And then the property owner, who is a customer only. You cannot make them a client, okay? Customer only. Now, there may be a third one, and that is you're the listing agent for the wholesaler. If you procure the buyer, maybe through an open house, whatever the case may be, then you have 2 choices. That end buyer can be a customer, or that end buyer can actually be a client principal, in which case that will also then generate an additional document, the dual agency disclosure. So in that case, there would be a total of 4 disclosures that you as the listing agent would need between you and the wholesaler, you and the property owner, you and the end buyer, and then possibly that dual agency form if that is your company policy. Again, that end buyer, if you procure them, it's whether they're a customer or a client is going to depend on your broker agency policy. So you're going to have to talk to your broker how they want to deal with that relationship. Now, one other thing, I mentioned it briefly, but you have to know, and we're going to talk more about this. I'm going to show you the form in part 3. There is an addendum to the agency disclosure. And it is an addendum that is required to be completed by the property owner and the end buyer. The wholesaler has nothing to do with this form. We're going to talk about it in the 3rd video. But again, this is required. If the property owner and the end buyer refuse to sign it when it's presented to them, then the same thing, you simply make a notation on the form, the date and time it was presented, and that they refuse to sign it. Again, this form cannot be modified or changed whatsoever. I've had several wholesalers, they don't like the fact that this form exists, and then they try to tell their agent that this part has to be removed and that part has to be removed. Nothing can change on this form because it's been codified in regulation by the Nebraska Real Estate Commission, and it must be presented to the property owner and the end buyer by the listing agent if they have procured the buyer. If there's an outside cooperating broker, that agent then would present it to their client. The listing agent would not be involved. But if it's a double bubble where the listing agent has procured the buyer, then this form must be given and presented to the buyer for execution. And it cannot be modified. I want to say this again because so many wholesalers are like, I'm not going to agree to that. The wholesaler is not involved in that transaction at all. They have no say whatsoever. It's by regulation. So another requirement that we need to talk about, now I do want to point this out, this is not a requirement of the Real Estate Commission directly, but there is a requirement, in my opinion, for you as a broker to have the original purchase contract between the wholesaler and the property owner. And there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, I have seen dozens and dozens and dozens of purchase agreements regarding wholesaling transaction between the wholesaler and the property owner. And many of them, and I'm not exaggerating, many of them don't even meet the essential elements of a valid legally binding contract in Nebraska. And number two, you need that purchase agreement because you as a broker need to verify that an equitable interest situation actually exists. Now, this is proof that the wholesaler actually has a contract. They actually have equitable title or equitable interest that you can market. Secondly is, then you have to make sure that there's a valid contract that establishes the equitable interest or title. Because you can't list a property that's for sale unless the person authorized to sign the listing contract has the authority to do it. That purchase agreement, it establishes the authority for the wholesaler to enter into a listing contract with you. Now, why is this an issue? Because an issue is only an issue when it's an issue. And let's say that there is a complaint that's filed after closing or there's a lawsuit. One of the first things that everybody's going to be looking at is, okay, we had the purchase agreement. Was it a valid purchase agreement? Did the wholesaler have even the authority to sign that listing agreement? And if not, then you as the broker, you could be in substantial jeopardy from a license law perspective, but also from a legal perspective. So you need to have that purchase agreement that establishes that authority or proves that authority. Number two is, again, the end buyer is going to be getting an assignment from the wholesaler of this contract. Remember, that's all from our first video. That's all an assignment contract is where we're taking that initial purchase agreement and we are assigning it to the new buyer on the end. And then closing happens between the end buyer and the property owner. So that end buyer, they're going to come to you, or their authorized representative is going to come to you and say, okay, we're interested, but we need to see the original contract so we know what we're assuming. And that is a document that must be provided to that potential end buyer so they can make an informed decision. So that's why we need, as a listing broker agent, we need a copy of the purchase agreement between the wholesaler and that property owner. All right, next is the disclosures. We need to talk about the seller property condition disclosure statement and the lead-based paint disclosure if it's a pre-78 house. Now, wholesalers, you aren't going to like this because there is additional documentation from a normal transaction between the legal property owner and a purchaser. So if you read the new regulation, there's going to be 2 seller property disclosures that's required and 2 lead-based paint if it's a pre-78 house. The first disclosure must be between the property owner and the wholesaler because there was a purchase contract that was engaged in, therefore it triggered the seller property disclosure requirement. Then we're going to need a second one, not between the wholesaler and the end buyer, but between the property owner and that end buyer. That's what the regulation says. The one thing I would caution against, and I honestly don't know how this is going to play out because there isn't precedent yet. I don't believe the way that the regulation is written and the way I interpret it is the wholesaler and the property owner have a seller property condition disclosure statement and everybody signs it. Then they just make an additional line for the end buyer. So you have one disclosure with the property owner, the wholesaler, and the end buyer signing that documentation. As I read the Seller Property Condition Disclosure Act and the regulations regarding this, I don't believe doing that would keep you in compliance with it. I could be wrong. Talk to your attorney. From a risk management perspective, what I would require as a broker to have 2 separate individual disclosures. So the property owner completes the first disclosure, including the lead-based paint, and then there are 2 copies made, one for the wholesaler, one for the end buyer, that will also keep from some inconsistencies between the two disclosures, that type of things. I will tell you this, I did directly speak with an EPA auditor, and they said there has to be 2 separate lead-based paint disclosures. If you add the end buyer onto that lead-based paint disclosure, you are modifying the disclosure, which is subject to a $46,500 per violation notice of violation. So if you're doing the lead-based paint, you might as well do the seller property condition disclosure statement at the same time. I know this particular part is not too popular with the community, but that is the rules and regulations. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of it. Now let's talk about the listing contract itself. So the listing contract, as I said before, is between the broker agent and the wholesaler. Now we need to start talking about some additional requirements for marketing. And once the wholesaler obviously signs that listing contract, a fiduciary duty is established, and now the agent is allowed to then go out and start marketing the equitable interest title in that contract. But look in bold print on your screen. We're going to talk more about this in the next slide, but I think you need to have this in the listing contract. Every company has a different, there's not a standard listing contract. Every company has their own, but there's always a blank paragraph in that listing contract. I think from a risk management point of view, this needs to be in there. It's a quote that's in part of the regulation for wholesaling. It says, the purpose of this contract is to market an equitable interest in a contract. We need to be able to distinguish that we're not selling legal title on behalf of somebody. We're selling an interest in a contract. So make sure your listing contracts have that phrase actually in it. All right, so we have the listing contract in place. Now we're going to go out and start marketing and advertising to find an end buyer for the equitable interest title in this wholesaling contract. Now, there are some things that you have to comply with according to the new regulation. Number 1, all marketing and advertising materials must clearly state that, quote, an assignable contract of real property is being marketed. That is for all of your marketing and advertising. That includes your Facebook post must have this in there, your tweets, your flyers, your MLS. If you're in an outstate MLS, then this needs to be in the public remarks. Now, as of the date of this video being taped, the Greater Plains Multiple Listing Service, which is Omaha, Lincoln, they do not allow these types of real estate transactions to be put in the MLS. However, that's probably going to change. The MLS board is going to meet to discuss the requirements, etc. But if and when the Great Plains actually they approve of these type of transactions being put in the MLS, this is going to be required to be in it. You as a listing agent, you need to make sure that this is you're in compliance with this. Okay, now let's look on your screen, and there is a highlighted bullet point there. This is really important. You must have, according to the new regulation, a written and signed statement, a permission statement from the property owner, not the wholesaler, but the property owner, giving your listing company permission and the authority to basically advertise and market the wholesaler's equitable interest. Remember, the equitable interest is in a piece of real property. That permission should also include if there's going to be showings and inspections. The wholesaler should not sign on behalf of the property owner, even if they have a power of attorney that gives them authorization to do it, even if the purchase contract, which was signed by the property owner, gives the wholesaler permission to do that, or gives the wholesaler's agent permission to do that, okay? And a lot of the purchase contracts will say that the property owner is given the wholesaler and or their agent, marketing the equitable title permission to do showings, inspections, to market, yada, yada, yada. That's great. But that's not what the regulation requires. The regulation requires a separate agreement between the listing company and the property owner. That is not negotiable. That's the regulation. And oh, by the way, from a risk management point of view, once again, just like agency disclosures, agents do not allow the wholesaler to get that form signed on your behalf. Now let's talk about yard signs, because I actually emailed Director Lemon about this. Because we have to have this assignable contract statement on all of our marketing, and yard signs is a form of marketing. Listing agents, if you put a for sale sign out in the yard, then I highly recommend that you have a rider that says assignable contract. So you have for sale assignable contract. So then the public can reasonably ascertain that this is a equitable interest that's being sold and not legal title. You have to have something. This isn't a recommendation for me. This is actually a requirement from the commission. Director Lemon said that the for sale sign needs to have something that indicates that this is an assignable contract that's being marketed. My suggestion is using a rider. And we talked about the MLS. Again, the statement and an assignable contract of real property is being marketed must be in the public remarks. One other thing I do want to talk about, again, right now, the Great Plains, you cannot put these type of transactions into the MLS. So the question comes up, does this violate the clear cooperation policy? And it does not. It's a transaction that can't be put in there anyway, so you don't need to get the waiver of benefits form signed by anybody because it's not an authorized transaction. Again, this may change at some point. The Great Plains Board of Directors may approve these type of transactions be listed in the MLS, but we're not there yet. All right, at some point, we're going to procure a buyer. Doesn't matter who procures the buyer. We find an end buyer to purchase that equitable interest title. So in this case, just like a normal traditional real estate transaction, a seller proceeds statement must be generated with the wholesaler because that is the person that you're representing in this transaction. So thus far in this video, we've been talking about the process from contract to close, okay? From that listing contract all the way through closing. I want to talk about the pending side of it. And this particular slide that you have on your screen, we're going to discuss the listing agent procuring the end buyer, creating that double bubble situation. What do you need or your brokerage needs in so far as documentation? Well, bullet point number one, we need the agency disclosure. Again, we already have one with the wholesaler. The wholesaler is our client. You are the limited seller's agent. We already have an agency disclosure signed by the property owner. The property owner is customer only. Now, what about the buyer that you procured to buy that equitable title interest? Now, again, your broker agency policy is going to determine or dictate how that end buyer is going to be represented. Are they a client or are they a customer? And if they're a client, then we have to do the dual agency form as well, in addition to that individual limited buyer agent agency form. Brokers, if you have not updated your agency policy, even if you're not going to allow your agents to do these type of transactions, you need to update your agency policy indicating that. So when the auditor comes and it gets audited, then you're going to be in compliance. I will tell you this, my recommendation from a risk management point of view in these double bubble situations is the end buyer really should be a customer and not a client. But again, brokers, that is your call. Number two, there is and I already talked about this, there is an agency disclosure assignable contract addendum. That's the name of it, and I'm going to cover that in the third video. It's an extra document for wholesale transactions, and it must be attached to the agency disclosure. It's an addendum to it, so it's part of it. That must also be executed by the end buyer, that assignee. Now, just to recap, that form or that addendum, the wholesaler has nothing to do with it. This is a separate agency addendum that's going to be completed by the end buyer and the property owner, because there's certain declarations in that form that have to be given to those two parties by you, the listing agent. And I will tell you, wholesalers have really been pushing back on this, as I've said, trying to change the language and all that stuff. None of that can happen. And you as the agent, you must present that form to them. Otherwise, it's a license law violation. Bullet point number 3 for your file. Obviously, you're going to need an executed assignment contract between the wholesaler and the end buyer. Bullet point number 4, a buyer's estimated cost sheet if that's your company policy to provide this to an unrepresented customer. If it's a dual agency situation, then it absolutely is required. Bullet point number 5, the seller property condition disclosure statement signed by the end buyer that was generated by the property owner. Remember, the property owner generates it, not the wholesaler. Number 6, lead-based paint disclosure if it's a pre-78 home. And then obviously any internal documents specific to your real estate company, such as an escrow instructions sheet, etc. Last thing I want to talk about is in the bottom of your screen in bold print there. We need to talk about the EPA pamphlet called Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. If this is a pre-78 type transaction, then the wholesaler must also be given, because they're the first purchaser, they must be given that pamphlet, and the end buyer must also be given that pamphlet as well. For whatever reason, a lot of people in this community think that because it's a wholesale transaction that all of this is exempted, and it's not. Now let's talk about the other side of the transaction, cooperating broker. So you're the buyer's agent, you represent your buyer, and you're the cooperating broker in a wholesale transaction. There's a couple of things that you need to know, as well as the listing agent. I do want to talk about a broker-to-broker commission agreement first. If this transaction is listed for sale in an MLS where there is an advertised cooperating agent payout, you don't have to do this. But like here in Omaha, Lincoln area, where there is these transactions are not authorized to be put into the MLS, then you must establish what that cooperating broker payment is. Because it's not advertised in the MLS, then the two brokers can negotiate what that cooperating broker payout is. Bullet point number 2, agency disclosure. The listing broker is not going to be involved in getting any kind of disclosures for the buyer because they're represented. But you buyer's agents, don't forget, you're going to have your agency disclosure. You're a limited buyer agency and they are your client. But don't forget, you're also going to need to have that addendum to that disclosure, because this is a wholesale transaction. Your end buyer needs to have that form. Bullet point number 4, obviously, cooperating brokers, you're going to need that executed assignment contract for the file. You know, in a normal transaction, you have the purchase contract. A copy of that is put into your file. In this case, it's an executed assignment contract that's going to be put into the file and audited by the commission auditors. Obviously, you need your buyer estimated cost sheet. You need a seller property condition disclosure statement signed by the property owner and the buyer. You're going to need the lead-based paint as well. And then you go through your in-house, your company-specific type forms that you need, such as a completed escrow instructions sheet, etc. So we have discussed the actual regulatory compliance part of this. I'm going to leave a link down in the video description, a link to the specific rules and regulations that the Real Estate Commission has put out, so you can read them specifically if you want to. I've just kind of digested it in a way that's a little bit more layman's terms, plus adding the conversations and correspondence with the director of the Real Estate Commission for interpretive reasons. But I highly suggest you go down and check them out for yourself. Now in part 3, video number 3, we're going to discuss actually the agency disclosure specifically, so you can have a visual reference for what I'm talking about. So if you want to watch that, I'm going to leave a link right up here. See you in the next video.